Welcome everybody to this class sponsored by Spark, the lifelong education program sponsored by UMKC in Kansas City. So this is going to be a single class called Who Wrote the Plays of William Shakespeare? Last a little bit more than an hour. My name is Don Dagenais. I'm one of the instructors for Spark, and this is a subject that I got interested in several years ago when I served for many years on the board of the Heart of America Shakespeare Festival here in Kansas City. So we're going to investigate the issue or the question of who wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. You might think that this is kind of a funny question. Is this a trick question, like, who's buried in Grant's tomb? I mean, who wrote the plays of William Shakespeare? The answer is obvious. William Shakespeare wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. Why should this be so hard? But the fact of the matter is, it's not quite that simple. So in the next sentence, I'm going to explain to you why it is that this question about who wrote the plays of William Shakespeare is a relevant question. And then the rest of the lecture really is going to flow from what we have in that sentence. So here it is. The reason why the question of who wrote the plays of William Shakespeare is a relevant question is that from what we know of what must have been true of the author of these plays, and from what we know of what actually occurred during the lifetime of the person actually known as William Shakespeare, there is no correlation between the life of the actual man and what must have been true of the author of the plays. And therefore, many literary sleuths over the years and historians and literary analysts have concluded that there's no way that the person known as William Shakespeare could have written these plays. And of course, if he didn't write them, then the next question is who did? So let's go back and state that a different way. We know certain things about the facts of the actual person known as William Shakespeare. We know a lot of what must have been true about the author of the plays from reading the plays themselves. But there is no connection between what we know of that author and what we know of the author that must have been true from our analysis of the plays, and therefore many have concluded that he couldn't possibly have written the plays. And if he didn't, then who did write the plays? And so that is the outline of what we're going to be exploring in the next hour or so. So first of all, let's start with this. I'm going to tell you in the next couple of minutes everything we know about the life of William Shakespeare. And then we're going to look at what we don't know about the life of William Shakespeare. And then we're going to look at what must have been true of the person who wrote the plays, as we can derive from the plays themselves. And then we will take a look at, if he didn't write them, then who else might have been the author. So let's start. And I think I can do this in a couple of minutes. We know that William Shakespeare was born on April 23rd of 1564. We know that because there was a baptismal certificate dated 3 days later. Back in those days, they didn't keep birth records, but they did keep baptismal records. His parents were John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. We do not believe that either one of them could read or write. Of his first 18 years, we know absolutely nothing. On November 27th of 1582, when he was 18, he took out a license to marry Anne Whateley, and the next day he married Anne Hathaway. 6 months later, Anne Hathaway gave birth to their first child, Susanna, and in 1585, about 3 years later, she gave birth to twins who were named Hamnet and Judith. A few years after that, Shakespeare left alone, leaving his family behind for London, and he was there for 10 years, and he apparently was a grain merchant. We know this from some commercial records, and he was once prosecuted for hoarding grain during a time of shortage. In 1592, there is a single mention of him in London as an actor in a play. In 1597, he returned to Stratford-upon-Avon and bought a home called the New Place, which was the second most valuable property in town. And in the following 14 years, many of the plays attributed to William Shakespeare were produced in London by the King's Players, his theater. Here are two references to him as an actor. We'll get back to this. In 1610 or 11, he returned to Stratford, continued as a grain merchant, and used his wealth to enter the business of loaning money, and was involved in several lawsuits over unpaid loans, including one involving a mere 47 shillings, which doesn't sound like much, and it wasn't. In 1616, he made his will, including the most famous bequest in English legal history, which is that he left to his wife, Anne Hathaway, quote, my second best bed, unquote. His will contains no mention of any books or manuscripts of any kind. These are the only known examples of his signature, and that's all we know about William Shakespeare. Now, let's go back and do that again because I want to review this in a little bit more detail. By the way, I think I did that in 2 minutes. So we know he was born April 23rd of 1564 because we have baptismal records. Back in those days, England didn't have birth certificates or birth records, but the churches did keep baptismal records, which is how we know. And it was traditional for the baby to be baptized 3 days after birth. Sorry, my computer has stopped working here in terms of advancing. There we go. Of his parents, we know very little. His father, John Shakespeare, was a merchant in London. He owned and ran a glove factory that made ladies' gloves. So he was a fairly prominent merchant at that time. At one time, he even served on the city council or town council of Stratford. His wife was Mary Arden. We know nothing about her. We do know pretty much for sure that John Shakespeare could not read or write. Which, by the way, was no shame. I mean, at that time in England, only about 5% of the population could read or write. 95% of the people were illiterate. No shame in being illiterate. Lots of prominent people could not read or write. There were really only 4 professions where you needed to know how to read or write. If you were a lawyer, you needed to be able to write legal documents and draft documents for the court and that sort of thing. If you were in the clergy, you needed to be able to read the scriptures to your parishioners. If you were in the theater business, you needed to be able to read plays and read manuscripts and scripts. And if you were a scrivener, and scriveners were the most common type of people who didn't know how to read or write. So there was a scrivener in the town square, and if you wanted to write a letter to somebody, you would go down to the town square, you would find the scrivener's shop, you would dictate the letter, the scrivener would write the letter for you, you would then put it in the post, and 3 weeks later, when you got your response, you would take the letter back to the scrivener and have the scrivener read it to you. And then the scrivener would write a response if you wanted to. So this is how correspondence, both business and personal, was done in London at those days. But those were the only categories of people who knew how to read or write. The reason why we think John Shakespeare couldn't was because we have some legal documents signed by him and his name is signed with an X. Now, back in those days, if you couldn't read or write, there were 2 ways you would sign a document. One way was to put an X on it, and then some witnesses would witness the document and say that so-and-so actually signed, and this is his mark. The other way was for a scrivener who could write to take your hand and literally guide your hand over the paper with a pen, and thereby sign your signature. Of course, it wasn't a good signature, but that was the other way to do it. Of Shakespeare's first 18 years, we know absolutely nothing. He did take out this license to marry Anne Whatley when he was 18 years old, and a day later he married Anne Hathaway. Different people, same person with a horrible misspelling of the name, we don't know. But spellings were not regularized at that time. Even common popular names and common names were not necessarily spelled the same way all the time. 6 months later, so she was pregnant at the time of their marriage, she gave birth to their first child, Susanna, and then in 1585, she gave birth to the twins. In 1587, he abandoned the family and went to London. There's no record that his family joined him there. And he was there for 10 years. He was a grain merchant, we know, because we have some records of his being in the grain business, including some lawsuits in which he was involved, in which he was sued for various things, or in which he would sue people for things. And we also have this mention of him being prosecuted for hoarding grain during a shortage in London. There's a single mention of him in London as an actor. There were very poor records kept of that time of plays and actors and casts and scripts and so forth, but there were some rough records kept, and there's a mention of him as an actor, which we're going to see in a minute. In 1597, he went back to Stratford and bought this valuable property, so he clearly had made some serious money between 1587 and 1597. And then, even though he was mostly located in Stratford, most of his plays were later produced in London that were attributed to him. This is the sheet of paper in which he is mentioned as a play. This is taken from a listing, a record made by somebody, and it's a little hard to read, but if over in the right-hand column, you can see a couple of references to Shakspur, which we think is probably Shakspur with a gross misspelling. If you look to the left of the first one, you can see a reference, if you can read through this handwriting, of Measure for Measure, one of Shakespeare's plays. And if you look at the top one, actually, which doesn't list him, you can see a reference to the Merry Wives of Windsor. And the bottom one, which does list him, refers to something of errors, place of errors, it looks like, but presumably that's Comedy of Errors, another one of his plays. The third one is awfully hard to discern, and we don't see any reference there to any Shakespeare play that we know. It refers to the Lord who sponsored the play. In 1610 and 11, he returned to Stratford. He continued as a grain merchant there, and he had accumulated quite a bit of wealth and went into the money lending business. And we know this because he was involved in several lawsuits over unpaid loans, where he was suing borrowers who had not repaid him, including one lawsuit for a tiny amount of money. Amazing that he could have even found a lawyer to have drafted the papers for that much money. So it probably was simply mere vengeance, which was the source of that, but we don't know. In 1616, he made his will, including that most famous bequest, which I mentioned because I'm a lawyer, and you learn about the Shakespearean bequest when you study bequests in law school. It's just famous because it's kind of funny. He left to his wife his second best bed. Where his first best bed went, we don't know. And this is interesting. His will contains no mention of any books or manuscripts of any kind. And now let's stop there for a second. One of the ways in which we know about the properties, that is the personal property, the possessions that people in London had at that time, was through the inventories taken at the time of their estate. And these inventories were part of the estate records and were published as part of the court records, so we can actually read them. People who are interested, for example, in what the bestsellers were in those days can go back and look at the estate inventories from English court records and find references of books that were listed. Books were very important. I'll get to that in a second. And you can kind of find out what the best-selling books were by looking at what books were in the estates of people who died. Remember, this was long before printing was very much available, and so books were very expensive. Many of them were copied by hand. Many of them were quite elaborate. It was very pricey to purchase a book. If a person owned a book, this was among the most prized possessions. Almost everybody had a family Bible, but many families had nothing more. If you had any more books than that, it was a matter of great pride. To have owned 5 books meant that you were pretty wealthy. To have 10 meant that you were very wealthy. So people would list their books by name and title in the inventory. This is something that anybody who was learned in any kind of profession would do if they died. There is no mention, surprisingly, of any books in Shakespeare's inventory. He apparently did not own it, not even a Bible. Now, these are the only 5 examples we have of signatures by William Shakespeare. The first one is on a deposition that he gave in a case that stretches across the top of the page. You can see the W, William, and something that looks like an S for Shakespeare. The second one was on a copy of a deed. The third one was on a mortgage where he mortgaged the same property. And the fourth and fifth actually appear on the same piece of paper. It is the last pages of his will. Now, I'm no handwriting expert, but people who have looked at these, and it looks as if these were not signed by the same person, with the possible exception of the bottom 2, which may have been a scrivener taking his hand and writing his signature. This is an indication of somebody who could not read or write, somebody who did not have a consistent signature. So that's what we know about William Shakespeare. What do we not know about William Shakespeare? We know nothing about his childhood experiences, his upbringing. We know nothing about his education. Now, here's an interesting thing. From the early days, when people were writing biographies of Shakespeare, they would go back to Stratford and they would look at the educational records from the school system, because one of the records that were well kept in those days were listings of students who would attend classes and what classes they were in, who the teachers were. You can find them. If you go back and look at the Stratford records for classes that Shakespeare would have taken in the years he was in those grades, the pages have been removed from the books. They've been sliced out. Somebody has taken a knife and cut out the pages for all of just those classes in just those years that Shakespeare would have attended. So there's been a cover-up. Somebody, somewhere, early on, because even a few years after his death, we have reports from people saying the records are missing. So shortly after his death, or perhaps even when he was alive, somebody went back and excised those pages from the records. Why is there a cover-up? Did he never go to school? We don't know, but those records are missing. So we have no records of his education. Now, you would think that anybody who wrote the plays would have at least attended college. There were only two universities in England at that time, Oxford and Cambridge. Neither university has any record of Shakespeare having attended, or anybody with a name even close to that attending at any time during the years when he might have. Neither one of them says he graduated there. You would think that if Shakespeare had gone to Cambridge, for example, they would be very proud of that and would be happy to publicize that. But instead, they've admitted for hundreds of years that there are no records of Shakespeare ever attending university. He may have been illiterate. You can see the signatures. We have no writings by him. The only things we have in his own pen are those signatures, which would indicate that he may have been illiterate. We have no writings of any kind. We have no writings by any acquaintances of his, which is interesting. Nobody who was a friend of Shakespeare's ever wrote any letters about him that have been preserved that we can read. You would think that anybody who was as famous as the author of all these plays would have been often written about in private correspondence. And we have many, many examples of private correspondence from people in London at that time, letters that have been preserved over the years and published and so forth. But nobody has left any mention at all of William Shakespeare, with one very minor exception, and that is that his son-in-law, who was a doctor, did write a couple of letters in which he mentioned his father-in-law, whom he clearly hated. He had nothing good to say about his father. We know nothing about his travels. Haven't any idea whether he ever traveled other than between Stratford and London. We know nothing about anything else. That's it. That's everything we know about William Shakespeare. Now, you may say, well, now, wait a minute. If I go to the library and go to the Shakespeare section of the library, I can find biographies of Shakespeare. I mean, I can pull biographies off the shelves that are 200 and 300 and 400 pages long. They're all about Shakespeare. How are people writing these long books of biography if this is all we know about the guy? The answer, I'm sorry to say, is very simple. They're making it up. If you look carefully at these biographies, and I've read 2 or 3 of them, what the authors say is things like, well, during the time that Shakespeare was a young boy, the school system in Stratford studied these particular books, and so surely he must have studied X, or he would have been exposed to Y. Or during the time he was a young boy in Stratford, there were traveling troops of players who would come and visit the town and would put on performances. And so it must be that his father, as a leading citizen of the town, would have taken him to traveling performances, and he probably would have seen X, or he would have seen Y, or he would be familiar with the classics, or he would have studied this. And when he went to the university, he undoubtedly was exposed to this, or he would have read the great Greek philosophers, he would have read the Roman philosophers, he would have read books of such and such. But they're just making it up. What they are doing is researching what was common at the time and assuming that Shakespeare must have been exposed to these things that other people were exposed to. But actually, in fact, we don't know anything else. So that's why it's a mystery. 400 years of scholarship has gone into this issue. Almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody who has studied this issue and looked at the life of Shakespeare and looked at the plays has made the obvious conclusion, which is this fellow could not possibly have written the play. Well, if he didn't write the plays, then who did? And there have been over 5,000 books or manuscripts, including things like PhD theses that have been written about the subject of Shakespeare and how he could have not written the plays and who might have written the plays. Every conceivable angle has been explored. We have many theories, but the bottom line is that we still don't know. There have been over 70 possible candidates that have been introduced to us through various literary explorations and books of history and literary detective work and so forth, proposing these candidates as possible authors of the Shakespeare plays. It is, of course, impossible for us to look at all these candidates, but we're going to look at the main ones in a bit. But first of all, let's turn to the other piece of information we must have about Shakespeare. And here I'm going to use Shakespeare rather than Shakspur, because whoever the author of the plays was, we do know a lot about that person because we can read the plays. And the plays themselves tell us an awful lot about who the author was. And almost everybody who has examined this question has started here. So let's look at this. First of all, he, and I'm going to say he, because it's almost certain that the author would have been a man. We'll explore the alternative in a minute, but I'll just use he. Knew a lot about the law and legal terms. There are trial scenes in The Merchant of Venice, in the case brought by Shylock against Antonio, in Measure for Measure, where Angelo is betrayed for betraying the state, and in A Winter's Tale, where Hermione is tried for adultery and high treason. These trial scenes contain detailed descriptions and detailed references to the words spoken by the barristers, by the judge, by the clerks, by the witnesses, and they are very true to what we think was historical, accurate descriptions of London trials at the time, or English trials at the time. In other words, whoever wrote these trial scenes really knew what they were doing. They were very accurate, obviously fictional portrayals of what might have happened in actual trials at that time. There are also many, many legal references other than in these trial scenes in the play. Almost every one of Shakespeare's plays includes references to the law, references to ordinances, references to punishments, references to witnesses, references to evidentiary rules, Latin words that were commonly used in legal arguments at that time that are used out of context, fit in other conversations, sometimes satirical, sometimes straightforward, lots and lots and lots of legal references. And one of the first things that almost everybody who reads the plays concludes is, whoever this was, they were really familiar with the law. Probably a lawyer themselves, but certainly very familiar with the law. Secondly, there's no question that whoever the author was, he was very familiar with the manners of the Elizabethan court. We know a lot about the people who were surrounding Queen Elizabeth I at that time. We know a lot about who they were, about what positions they held, about what positions they took in various court disputes at the time, and so forth. And there are many, many references in Shakespeare's plays to these people. Sometimes direct, sometimes disguised, sometimes satirical, sometimes making fun of people at the court. It is clear that Shakespeare was on the inside of the court. He knew about things that were court intrigues or court rumors that may not have been known by people in the outside world, but certainly were known by people at the court. And he would put references, oftentimes joking references or satirical references in his plays to these things. Now, a lot of this stuff goes over us today. When we attend a Shakespeare play, most of us are not Elizabethan scholars, so we don't really understand the details. So some of it flies by, and we don't even know. But those who are familiar with the history of the Elizabethan court and the personalities of the court can pick up on lots and lots of there are references to sports, but interestingly, now this was long before team sports, but there were other sports. The most popular sports of the nobility were hunting and falconry. Falconry being the art of training falcons to fly and carry messages and make trips to various places and bring back trinkets and so forth and so on. It was one of the things that people who had a lot of leisure time, in other words, who didn't have to work for a living, people who were in the aristocratic classes did. There are many references in Shakespeare's plays to details of hunting and falconry and practices like that. Again, many of these go past modern audiences, but those who are familiar with this see lots of those references. There's many references to classical philosophy. Cicero, Caesar, lots of Roman philosophers are quoted. The ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and others are quoted or referred to. Again, sometimes in a straightforward manner, sometimes in a satirical manner, but there's lots of quotations and references to that. So whoever this is, they were very familiar with the writings of philosophy by the Greek and Roman philosophers. And also contemporary philosophers, because there is mention made, and sometimes fun made of, those who were writing contemporary philosophy that at Shakespeare's time. Many references to statecraft and statesmanship. He was obviously very familiar with people who held official posts, people who were sent overseas by Queen Elizabeth as ambassadors, people who returned and made ambassadorial reports on what was happening in English possessions elsewhere, and so forth and so on. Lots of references to those sorts of things, again, many of which kind of go past us. Whoever this was really knew English history and European history generally. Well, first of all, there are a lot of history plays, as you know. There's King Henry V and King Henry IV and Julius Caesar and Antony Cleopatra and many others. I mean, there are many plays that are based upon events of history, English history, and history elsewhere. And there are many historical references in other plays, even if they aren't the history plays. So whoever this was did a lot of study of history. There are many references to classical literature. There are many phrases that are used that are taken from other languages, especially French, Italian, and Spanish. So whoever this was, they either knew or knew enough of those languages to make quotations of various famous writers of those languages, quotations from Plutarch, for example, things like that. And especially with regard to Italy, whoever the author was knew a lot about Italian geography and places of interest in Italy. They must have traveled to Italy, maybe extensively. Two of the plays are set in Verona, Romeo and Juliet and Two Gentlemen of Verona. Two are set in Venice, Othello and The Merchant of Venice. But many of the other plays as well make reference to Italy and the trees and mountains, forests and towns and bridges and cathedrals in Italy. So whoever this was knew a lot about Italy. They also knew at least something of France. One play in particular, Measure for Measure, is set in the court of Navarre in France. And whoever it was knew that court very well, because there are references to things that happened at the court of Navarre in that play that nobody who was not an intimate of that court would have known. Astronomy, astrology, many references to that, not only with regard to the stars and steering ships and that sort of thing. You can find those, for example, in The Tempest, but many other references as well. Astrology was considered to be a legitimate science back in those days, and there are references to people's fortunes being cast in horoscopes and that sort of thing. Oddly enough, horticulture and garden design. If you've ever visited England, you know that the English are fastidious about their gardens. They have very particular designs that they put together of gardens. There's a very definitely an English style of designing gardens, how you design the walkways and the plantings and the flowers and the trees and the pathways and the things that people look at and where the benches are placed and all of that. And there is reference in Shakespeare's plays several times to the design of English gardens. So whoever he was, he knew about that. Music in musical terms. There are many references in Shakespeare's plays requiring music in some of the of the instructions in the plays. He will call for music to be performed at a certain time, and matter of fact, he'll even call for particular types of music. You know, happy music, romantic music, strange music. He requires these things, and he also refers many times to instruments. Somebody's voice may sound like a broken flute or something like that. And so whoever it was knew something about music in musical terms. By the way, footnote, there's lots of wonderful music which has been written about incidental music to Shakespeare's plays. For example, Mendelssohn's famous music to Midsummer Night's Dream, and many others. And of course, lots of operas based on Shakespeare's plays. But Shakespeare himself knew a lot about music. References to printing, folklore, fairy mythology, theatrical management, and the practices of the theater. There's lots of jargon in Shakespeare's plays that obviously arose from Cambridge University. Now, this is something that escapes us, but Cambridge and Oxford were two universities which were not much competition in those days as now. And the graduates of those universities tended to use certain phrases, certain words that they grew accustomed to at the university, oftentimes as sort of almost a kind of a private language between them, so they could recognize each other in conversation. So if you were an educated person and you were talking to somebody who'd been to the university, you could probably find out just by listening to them, even though they never mentioned it, which one of those two universities they went to. Shakespeare's plays are full of references to Cambridge, not Oxford. There are references to the Freemasons. Most of us think of the Masons now as being a fairly harmless organization, but back at that time, it was really kind of a subversive group spread throughout Europe, which was anxious to get rid of aristocracy, get rid of kings and queens, establish republican forms of government and various other things. So it was, there were a lot of code words and so forth that were used by Masons to communicate with each other because they might be prosecuted if their true intent was known. There are references in Shakespeare's plays to words and phrases that would have been intimate with people who are Freemasons, who would have communicated with each other through this kind of language. And it appears in Shakespeare's plays. Cryptology, medicine, psychology, fishing and angling. It goes on and on. Here are some of the recurring themes in his plays. 260 references to classics and mythology, 196 to sports and games, 192 to war and weaponry, 172 references to seas, sailing, or ships, 124 to legal practices in the courts, and 74 to theatrical practices in theater. And we can go on and on. Let's talk about Shakespeare's vocabulary. Today, an average person that you just meet on the street in the United States or in Britain probably has a vocabulary of around 4,000 or 5,000 words. Words they would recognize and be able to use in ordinary conversation. Words that they could give you the definition of. If a person is educated, has a university as education, that goes up to probably 6,000 or 7,000. A college professor or an expert in some field might have a vocabulary of up to 7,500 or even 8,000 words, although many might be words that are particular to their particular field of study, for example, a chemist or somebody like that. In Shakespeare's plays, over 15,000 different words are used, including several hundred that he coined himself. 15,000 words, triple the amount of words that an ordinary person would have known, and well more than double of the ordinary educated person. By comparison, the great writer of the next generation after Shakespeare, Milton, used about 8,000. And just for reference purposes, the King James Version of the Bible has about 5,600. Understandable, because it's intended to be read by ordinary people, not a wide vocabulary. So, the conclusion by virtually everybody who has studied this carefully is Shakespeare couldn't possibly have written the plays. There's no relation between the life of this person, Shakspur, and the author Shakespeare who wrote the play. Well, why, if there was a person who did write the play, who was very educated and sophisticated and capable of doing the sorts of things that Shakespeare did, why would you think that that person would not simply publish the plays under their own name? Why would they have had to use a nom de plume like William Shakespeare? Wouldn't you have thought that the author, or the most celebrated author we now know today in all of the English language, would have been very proud of being the author of these plays and might have happily put his name on them? Well, there are several reasons why a person might not have wanted to do that. First of all, you have to understand the theater in Shakespeare's day was a very disreputable place. The Globe Theater, where Shakespeare's plays were performed by his company, the King's Players, for example, entertained all sorts of different kinds of events. One of the most popular events was bear baiting. And I'm not kidding. Somebody would go out into the forest near England and find a live bear, bring the bear back to the theater, at the appointed time, chain the bear to a post in the middle of the theater, and then people with knives and swords would surround the bear and slash at the bear, causing it to bleed and roar, and finally would kill the bear that would lie in a pool of blood in the middle of the theater. This is what they called entertainment back in Shakespeare's day. And oftentimes there would be a bear baiting in the morning, and then a Shakespeare play would be put on in the afternoon. That's the kind of places that did Shakespeare's plays. So the theater was not really a place where upper class, sophisticated people necessarily wanted to go. Although there were some plays that were very popular by some playwrights, and many times people of aristocratic classes who wanted to attend the theater would go in disguise. We have a number of reports of members of Elizabethan court going to the theater in disguise. You'd wear a cloak with a hood, maybe put on a mask so nobody knew who you were, sit in the upper reaches of the seats and enjoy the play in disguise because you didn't really want anybody to recognize you or know that you were there. There are even rumors that Queen Elizabeth herself went to plays in disguise. We don't know if that's true. Then keep in mind that the person who must have written these plays was a person of very high social standing, a person of a very aristocratic class. Well, aristocrats were not supposed to work for a living. They were supposed to live off the income of their estates, produced by the peasants and the farmers on their estates. They weren't supposed to be earning money. And so to write a play and have that play performed for money is really kind of beneath the dignity of anybody in a true aristocratic lifestyle. And then keep in mind, there were lots of references to people in the Elizabethan court who were often satirized or criticized in the play. Probably would not be a good idea for somebody who's a member of that court to be quite so open about the fact that they had written this piece that satirized somebody. You might find yourself on the other end of a sharp knife if you were too offensive in writing your play. So that's why probably the plays, well, certainly the plays were not published under the name of the true author. So William Shakespeare was a nom de plume. It was a fake name in many people's estimation. So who did write the plays? Okay. Well, here are some candidates I'm going to go over as we finish up the session. So these are just 7. I've picked out 7, which is only about 1/10 of the people who have been promoted as possible authors of the plays, but these are major ones. And I want to explore these one at a time to see what you think. Well, first of all, okay, let's consider, we need to give him a fair chance. Let's consider William Shakespeare. Could he possibly have written the plays, this man who had the characteristics that we earlier described? Well, there are several arguments in favor of his actually being the writer of the plays, the most prominent of which is simply tradition has it that way. Ever since shortly after he died, he was thought to have been the author of the plays. Stratford erected a statue to him as the author of the play. Of course, that may have just been marketing. They were clever in those days about wanting to market and attract tourists. Stratford, just as you might think today. There were several contemporary writers who identified Shakespeare as the author, but that's not necessarily determinative, as other plays may have been written, as others may have written the plays under his name, or they may have been covering up. He is identified as the author in the first folio, which is the first collection of all of Shakespeare's plays, compiled by 2 of the King's Men actors, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, a few years after Shakespeare died. By the way, the composition of the first folio, the bringing together of these plays, was not as easy as you might think. There were no scripts available for any of Shakespeare's plays. Back in those days, when a playwright wrote a play, what the playwright would do is he would pull out a series of scrolls and he would write each actor's script in a separate role. And so then whoever got a certain role in the play would be given that script, and whoever got another role would be given that script, and there was no one combined script of the whole play. In other words, the actors didn't have the other actors' lines. And so to take all these roles and find them and discover them and put them together in one script was not an easy thing. And he wrote 37 plays, so it was a huge task to compile the first folio, but they did it. By the way, just as a note, the reason why today we say that an actor has received a role in a play, it means that they were given a role in the old days, which contained their lines. We still use that terminology today. But he was identified, Shakespeare was, as the author in the first folio. Stratford-upon-Avon promoted him, as we said, but the most interesting evidence may be Ben Jonson's poem. Ben Jonson was a very prominent author and playwright at that day, and certainly would have known who the author or authors of the Shakespeare plays were. And this is a poem he wrote, which is often cited by those studying this issue. Let's read this together. Poor Poet-Ape, ape in the sense of a person who's aping somebody else, imitating somebody else. Poor Poet-Ape, that would be thought our chief, whose works are even the frippery of wit, from brokerage has become so bold a thief, as we, the robbed, leave rage and pity. In other words, there are other playwrights from whom this person is stolen, and they have so far beyond rage that they now only pity this thief. At first he made low shifts, would pick and glean by the reversion of old plays, now grown to a little wealth. In other words, he's gotten rich, and credit in the scene, so he's being given credit as being the author. He takes up all and makes each man's wit his own. And told of this, he slights it. Tut, such crimes the sluggish gaping auditor devours. He marks not whose 'twas first, and after times may judge it to be his as well as ours. In other words, he's stealing. Fool, addressing himself now to the thief, as if half-eyes will not know a fleece from locks of wool, or shreds from the whole. He's apparently saying here that future generations will know that you didn't really write this stuff, that you stole it from other people. Is that what the poem means? Does it mean something different? It's often cited, and maybe the best evidence we have. This, by the way, is the frontispiece of the first folio, which at the top says, "To the memory of my beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare," and at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see it's written by Ben Jonson. It's written in the form of a poem. We don't have time, of course, to go over it, but I can tell you that books have been written about this page because there are many people who think that in his pretended memorial to William Shakespeare, Johnson, in fact, left clues as to who the real authors of the plays were. So, I mean, you can read it you can read it from back to front, from front to back. You can read it sideways. You can read it upside down. People think there are anagrams in it. People try to read the letters up and down, trying to see if there's some secret code. It's been much studied. Okay, well, here's the first candidate for who might have authored the Shakespeare plays, Sir Francis Bacon. He was the son of Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper of the Seal, which meant that he was an aristocrat in Elizabeth's court. He studied at Cambridge. He studied law at Gray's Inn. He entered Parliament at the age of 23, served numerous constituencies. He studied law and philosophy. He was a writer. He practiced law. As a matter of fact, he was a prosecutor in one of the most famous cases from England those days, where the Earl of Essex, who had been presumably a lover of Queen Elizabeth, actually tried to revolt against her, and this was a case where he was prosecuted for rebellion. Francis Bacon negotiated the Union of England and Scotland. He was a scientist. He served as Solicitor General and Attorney General. He traveled widely, including to Italy and France and Germany. So far, sounds like he is a legitimate candidate. There are, however, some objections to Francis Bacon. First of all, he was not a poet. We can see examples of poetry he tried to write, and they're pretty crummy. He authored no poems or plays that we know of, at least of any sophisticated nature, under his own name. He did write some things, mostly in the scientific realm, but his writing style differs markedly from that of Shakespeare. His main published work was about science and philosophy, and it's a completely, utterly different style from what we can tell by looking at Shakespeare's works. And there's no evidence, really, to connect him with the theater at all. Okay, here's another candidate, William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby. He studied law at Lincoln's Inn, traveled widely to France, Spain, and Italy. He was acquainted with the theater. As a matter of fact, his family even sponsored a company of players. He was from an aristocratic family. He was socially prominent, and he was a member of the Elizabethan court. He spent a lot of time in France at the court of Navarre and was quite familiar with its customs and personalities. This is highly pertinent to Measure for Measure. We don't know of any other Englishman at the time who would have been that familiar with the French court. I like this one. The story of Hamlet originates with a French tale, which was very familiar to those at the court of Navarre. There was a Jesuit spy in England at the time whose name was George Fenners. He reported that Stanley was, during his time in France, quote, busied only in penning comedies for the common players, unquote. So he was writing plays, but there's no reference to any specific play. Some people have pointed out the references to Will and W.S. fit William Stanley just as well as they do William Shakespeare. Not sure how strong a piece of evidence that is. The major evidence for him relates to The Tempest, one of Shakespeare's final plays. The Tempest focuses on a character named Prospero, who is a wizard and magician, undoubtedly based upon a real-life figure named John Dee, who is a learned magician, scholar, and counselor to Queen Elizabeth. He was familiar in traditions of the occult. He was a teacher of esoteric knowledge, thought to be something of a wizard or a magician. And William Stanley was a close acquaintance of Dee. Would have known the things you would have needed to know to write the character of Prospero. And furthermore, the island may have been based upon an island among the Isles of Man, which the Derby family owned. However, there is a case against William Stanley. He is described in several sources as dabbling in writing, not the sort of serious writing that we would have seen from the true Shakespearean author. But here's the problem. He was still living in 1623 when the first folio was published. He survived Shakespeare by a number of years, and the preface to the first folio clearly states that Shakespeare was dead. Roger Manners, the 5th Earl of Rutland. He studied law, traveled extensively, studied at Cambridge. He was born in a noble family. He was a member of the Elizabethan court and was an ambassador to Denmark, where he may have heard the Denmark legends, which are the basis of Macbeth. I love this one. Among his fellow students were two named Rosencrantz and Gilda, who, as you probably know, are characters from Shakespeare's play Hamlet. Not exactly common names. Who would have thought? But the problem is Roger Manners was not born until 1564. He was 12 years younger than Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's earliest plays were performed when Roger Manners was still a child. So he could not possibly have had a part in the earlier plays, maybe in the later. Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe was Shakespeare's exact contemporary, and he was Shakespeare's main competitor as a playwright in London. He was a famous playwright, wrote many wonderful plays. His plays are still done sometimes on the London stage. His writing style is very similar to Shakespeare's, particularly Shakespeare's early plays. Even if he didn't write the Shakespeare plays, there are many people who think that Shakespeare learned a lot from Marlowe, studying his writing style and copying his style in some of his earlier plays. Marlowe was from Cambridge. He was very familiar with the theater, obviously. Well, this is interesting. It's widely believed that in addition to his career as a playwright, Marlowe was also a spy. He traveled extensively throughout the continent and may have been a spy for the Elizabethan court. The most telling example is that when he was a student at Cambridge, he was absent for a long period of time in the continent. He was about to be removed. He was about to be evicted, thrown out of Cambridge as a student. But the Privy Council, the main council of aides and high-level advisors to the Queen, sent a letter to Cambridge University declaring that Marlowe had been employed, quote, on matters touching the benefit of his country, unquote, which is well known as code words for being a spy. And as a result, Cambridge did not throw him out as a student. In 1901, there is a literary expert named Dr. Thomas Mendenhall who did an extensive analysis using what he called fingerprinting. He looked at the writing styles of various people from whom we have examples of writing from Shakespeare's day. And he looked at the length of sentences and the length of phrases and how often certain verbs are used, how often certain descriptions are used, so forth and so on. And he looked at dozens and dozens of examples of writings from various prominent people, and he concluded that there was a very, very close similarity between the writings of Marlowe and Shakespeare. There is a case against Marlowe, and that is that he was murdered in 1593. And he died too young to have written most of the later Shakespeare plays. Or was he murdered? This is actually one of the great mysteries of English legal history. Marlowe supposedly died in a brawl at a tavern. The only evidence was the testimony of two witnesses, who many people later felt were not particularly strong witnesses. The body was never found. Nobody was ever convicted of the murder. There is some evidence that Marlowe may have turned into a double agent. Maybe he was an agent for the Queen and then was bought off and made an agent by another country. Or maybe he was a triple agent, an agent for the Queen who pretended to be bought off, but really was still an agent for the Queen. At any rate, he was involved in some very, very touchy and extremely dangerous affairs. So if you were 39 years old or of any age, and you were discovered to have been a double or triple agent, and people were hot on your trail, what might be a good thing for you to do? Maybe it would be a good thing for you to disappear. And what better way for you to disappear than to fake your own death? Perhaps Marlowe wasn't murdered, but died and lived hidden away somewhere and wrote the Shakespearean plays. Of course, that would perfectly explain why he couldn't publish them under his own name. There are possible allusions to his murder in the play As You Like It. There is one major disadvantage to Marlowe, and that is that he was not a member of the nobility. He was not familiar with the Elizabethan court. He was a person who could publish plays under his own name. Translation, he was not an aristocrat. So how could he have known about the sorts of things that a member of the court would? Well, this is the most famous candidate, Edward de Vere. 17th Earl of Oxford. He was born to a noble family. He studied law at Cambridge, traveled widely, especially to Italy. He is known to have written plays in his youth, that is, in his student days at Cambridge. So we have some it was permissible for students to write plays, even though it's not something you would have done once you graduated, if you were interested. Several of his plays have been analyzed, and the writing style is quite familiar to at least the young Shakespeare. He was definitely a member of the court of Queen Elizabeth. He patronized the theater. He sponsored some of the companies of actors. He was really unknown as a candidate for being a Shakespeare author until 100 years ago, when Francis Looney, who was a literary critic and expert, conducted a book, conducted a very detailed study on comparing what must have been known about the person who wrote the Shakespeare plays to various people who were potential authorship candidates. And he dug way deeper than anybody had before and brought up a number of people who nobody had even heard of before, including Edward de Vere, who was unknown. And he thought that de Vere's writing style, from the writings de Vere left behind, and he did leave behind some writings, including some poems, and Shakespeare's were very close, and his life paralleled almost exactly what somebody would have had to have done in order to have written the play. There's an interesting parallel between the story of Hamlet and de Vere's own life. De Vere's father was murdered. His mother, a month later, married the man who was widely thought to have murdered his father. That is the plot of Hamlet. And this was de Vere's own family story. He practiced law at the courts. He traveled to Italy, including Venice. Just about 20 years ago, some researcher in the British Museum, or the British Library, excuse me, found a copy of the de Vere family Bible, which had been given to the museum at some point by one of de Vere's ancestors or descendants. And it turns out, if you look at the de Vere family Bible, that there's a very interesting feature. Shakespeare makes many references in his plays to things in the Bible. And if you look up the places in the Bible that Shakespeare referred to, in almost every place there are marginal notations made, we're sure, by Edward de Vere, because the handwriting appears to match, in which he's made notations of those particular passages of the Bible that are later used in Shakespeare plays. Either an amazing coincidence, or he must have had something to do with the play. There are many references in Shakespeare's sonnets that fit the life of the Earl of Oxford. For example, there are some sonnets where he addresses these apparently to Queen Elizabeth and says, I was honored to have had the opportunity to escort you in a certain procession. Well, here's a drawing showing Edward de Vere escorting Queen Elizabeth in a procession. There are many sonnets that are addressed to a dark lady, as you know. De Vere was known to have had an affair with Anne Vavasour, who was a dark-complexioned lady who was a member of the Elizabethan court. Could he have written those sonnets and addressed them to her? The frontispiece of the sonnets as published is to, quote, our ever-living poet, unquote. Ever-living is code word in English at the time for somebody who's dead. In other words, somebody who's not living now, but whose reputation will survive them forever. And de Vere was deceased at the time the sonnets were published. The main case against Edward de Vere is that he died in 1604. Shakespeare's plays continued to be premiered through 1612, when the Globe Theatre burned down. So how do we explain that? By the way, for future reference, in 2011, there was a movie called Anonymous, which was about the subject of Edward de Vere writing the Shakespeare plays. It's fictional, but it's a lot of fun. And if you have nothing to do during these stay-at-home days, why, by all means, bring it up on Netflix and watch it. It's quite a good movie. And also, I should note that UMKC, the sponsor of the Spark programs, there's a professor in the theater department, who many of you probably know, Felicia Landre, who is one of the nation's leading experts on this subject, and she is an enthusiastic proponent of de Vere being the author. Those who propose de Vere as the author are called Oxfordians, because he was the 17th Earl of Oxford. Those who think that Shakspur was the author of the plays are called Stratfordians, because he was from Stratford. So she is a leading Oxfordian in the nationwide debate on this issue, and has given many lectures nationwide and in England as well about this subject. Okay, Sir Walter Raleigh is another candidate. He was educated at Oxford, though, not Cambridge. Born to an aristocratic family, clearly a member of the Elizabethan court, a very accomplished writer and poet, very knowledgeable at ships and seafaring. He was an admiral in the Queen's Navy. The problem is there's little to connect him with Shakespeare other than his seafaring knowledge. He did leave behind some writings, but the style does not match Shakespeare's, and he was not a poet. He was not familiar with the theater. The main case against Raleigh was that he was overseas much of the time when the plays were written, leading naval expeditions, exploring America. When could he possibly have had time to write all these plays? Nonetheless, there are some people, including Mark Twain, who felt that Sir Walter Raleigh was a very strong candidate, which is why I mentioned. And lastly, I want to bring up a currently popular candidate, although there are a few who take this terribly seriously, of a woman, Emilia Basano, who was a member of the Elizabethan court. She was a published author. She published a book of poetry in 1611, which is very fine. Her name is Emilia. Interestingly enough, there are lots and lots of women in Shakespeare's plays named Emilia, which is odd because it was not a particularly popular name among people in England at the time. She, in her book of poetry, she was a great defender of the rights, such as they were at that time, of women. There is a famous speech made in Shakespeare's play Othello about the rights of women, which is delivered by a character named Emilia. In her poets, she uses the theme of women trapped in loveless marriage. She herself was trapped in a loveless marriage. She had an affair with another member of the court. She apparently gave birth to a child. In order to cover it up, this count arranged a marriage of her and a musician at the court, not a particularly high-standing member of the court, and they did not love each other or spent little time together, and she was trapped in this loveless marriage. And it's one of her themes in her poets, and is also a theme in Shakespeare's sonnets. A number of his sonnets refer to women being trapped in loveless marriages. There's an Italian connection here, which might explain the Italian familiarity in Shakespeare's plays. She was probably of Jewish background from Venice. The name Bassanio, the Italian version of her name, appears in a couple of Shakespeare plays. There's a character named Basinius, which is the Roman version, in Titus Andronicus, and The Merchant of Venice has a character named Bassanio. The case against her is that that's really about all we have to really tie her to it. There's no indication that she's familiar with the laws of the courts or Cambridge or seafaring or anything else. Her writing style, although she was a fine poetess, does not show a lot of similarity to Shakespeare. There are no contemporaneous writings. Sure, one book was published very late in Shakespeare's life. If you're interested in pursuing the idea of a woman being the author of Shakespeare's plays, Mary Sidney, pictured here, whom I'm not going to talk any further about, is probably a better candidate, although there are a few who think that she really could have written the work. Well, what about the idea that maybe a bunch of people got together and wrote the Shakespeare play? This would seem to be the obvious explanation, because each candidate we discussed has strengths, but also has weaknesses. So this would enable you to combine the strengths of these various candidates. It might explain the phenomenal vocabulary. It might explain the many and varied source materials for the play. For example, the Earl of Stanley may have been the source for Measure for Measure, which takes place in the court of Navarre. Maybe Vere would have been the source for Hamlet, and Stanley might have been the source for the Macbeth play in Scotland, and so forth. It explains the author's familiarity with many foreign lands and languages, and it explains the longevity of the career. He had a very long career, whoever this was, nearly 20 years long, which is very long for a playwright in that day, longer than any other playwright, and left behind 37 plays, far more than anybody else from that. There are some problems. Well, first of all, if there's going to be a group, you need to decide who's in the group. And so you need to go over that list of candidates again and maybe add a bunch more, and it's not clear who was in the group. And there must have been somebody who was a leader of the group who edited and finalized these plays. You don't just take contributions of a bunch of different people and throw them together and come up with a finished play. Well, who was the editor? Francis Bacon? Maybe it was De Vere? Shakspur himself? We have no evidence that that might have been. Why would Ben Jonson and others have praised a person clearly referred to as a person named Shakespeare when the author was a group? You can think of explanations for that, but we're not clear on why that would have been the case. And if it really was a group of people who got together in secret to create these plays, how did it function so well for so long, and how did it remain a secret? Very hard to keep a conspiracy alive for a long period of time. Well, maybe the answer lies in Ben Jonson's poem that we read earlier, The Poet-Ape, which describes a person, Shakespeare, presumably, who was a thief who stole the works of others, who passed them off as his own, enraged others who were unable to do anything about it, but they were hopeful that the future generations would uncover the fact that this was a theft. But on the other hand, the first folio contains the same author's tribute to William Shakespeare. So how could he write a tribute to somebody who was a thief? The answer is, we don't know. But maybe you now have enough information so that you can begin to form your own opinion, and maybe you have an idea of who wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. Lori, do you want to unmute people and we can take any questions?
Okay, Solda, okay, go ahead.
No, there's Judy.
Miss Judy.
Go, Linda.
I'm in there too.
Go, Bill.
I'm on, can you hear me? Judy?
Yep.
Okay, can I say something, Judy?
Sure.
Getting everybody on, sorry.
I think they're all here, just their pictures are coming up slowly. Go ahead, Judy.
Okay. I have so much respect for Felicia Landry, for one thing, and if she's studied all this, I'm voting for Edward de Vere for a whole lot of reasons, including that. So he sounds to me like the most obvious or maybe qualified.
I'm gonna press on.
All right, go ahead.
Go, Simi.
Any other questions, comments?
I've got a question. Is this, I've seen a lot of Shakespeare, but I'm not really informed enough to understand if perhaps plays were written by different people. Have they decided they were all written by the same person?
No, there has been no decision. Clearly, there's a similar writing style, and Shakespeare's writing style changed over the years. You can look at the early plays, you can look at the later plays, and the style has changed. But still, if you look at the plays and those that were written about the same time, there's a consistency of style. That's one of the arguments against different people writing them, because why would the style be so similar unless there was an editor who was sort of adapting them and modifying them to a consistent style. So the idea that a bunch of different people truly wrote the plays separately is not widely held, but that many people may have contributed to them is.
Thank you.
I have a question. Don, do you have a favorite theory?
I tend to, yes. I tend to think that it's a group theory, that probably there were several people who contributed to the plays just because there are too many people who are good candidates. That there probably was an editor. De Vere is a very likely candidate, but I cannot explain to you how the plays would have been continued to be published for almost 10 years after his death. Somebody else obviously took over as the editor, and yet the style appears to be fairly similar. There would have been a reason why everybody would have wanted to keep this a secret, and that is that they wanted to make sure, but because they were all members of the Elizabethan court, and they were all in danger of being criticized and perhaps the subject of vengeance by people whom they had satirized in the play. So that would be a reason why the group was kept together. But that still leaves lots of open questions in terms of who was involved and who was the editor and so forth. But I don't see an explanation that's any better. I don't see any one of these candidates being, considered to be solely the author. But that's just me. You all have your own opinion.
Well, you know more than I do.
Leanne, you have a question?
A comment, really. For some time, I've been following a Facebook group called Shakesvere, Shakesvere, which of course is a group of Oxfordians. And obviously the people who follow that and contribute to it are real Shakespeare nerds. And it's very interesting to read their comments and their scholarship, some of which is more learned than others, but it's a very interesting group. And you might want to take a look at that if you're truly interested. I personally am an Oxfordian, and so I think that's the thing that makes the most sense. And Don, your comments regarding the group theory with Edward de Vere perhaps being the editor, that's very interesting to me. So that's all I've got.
Thank you.
Is there a place to raise your hand?
Yeah.
Wow.
In there.
So I will just say that Shakespeare, it awes me, it stuns me that in college they don't separate the comedies for one semester and the tragedies to another semester. It is all meshed together. It's just difficult. I took that class. Everybody that was an English major was just dreading it. And then my second son was an English major. And, I asked the question, have they separated the comedies from the tragedies? No, it was one big, it's like an encyclopedia. That you have to take that class and remember all of that. I did go through Shakespeare's home. The one thing that kind of stunned me was the fact that there was wallpaper. I didn't really think that, they would have wallpaper back then. And everything was so much smaller, like the beds and the furniture and the chairs were shorter to the ground. So, and I love Stratford-upon-Avon. That was a great place to be. Done.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. I have to be somewhere, so I have to say goodbye. I thank you so much. I didn't know very much about this. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. This was great.
Yes.
Everybody can expect an email from me with a link to a SurveyMonkey evaluation of the class. There are opportunities for you to type in things as well as give thumbs ups for different things. Your feedback helps us be able to know what we're doing well and what we're not. So obviously Don did a fabulous job, and this was very well researched and planned, but there could be some things in the format that we could do differently and better. Those are going to be things that are going to be important to know as well.
Okay.
Thank you.